The sun had nearly disappeared beneath the horizon, painting the vast West Australian sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson. As darkness fell over the remote outback, a group of men gathered around a campfire, its flames casting dancing shadows across their withered faces. The day's work on the rabbit-proof fence, that ambitious barrier slicing through the continent, was done. And now was time for stories. Among them sat Arthur Upfield, a man whose hands had grown calloused from manual labour, but whose mind remained sharp with literary ambition. His portable typewriter, an unusual possession for a boundary rider, sat protected in his tent. Tonight, however, he wasn't writing, but posing a literary problem to his colleagues that would later haunt him. Welcome to Strewth, a podcast where we delve into the most perplexing mysteries Australia has ever witnessed. For those of you wondering about the title, Strewth is the type of word you'll hear muttered around campfires when someone's tale crosses into the unbelievable. It's an old contraction of God's truth, our way of saying what I'm about to tell you sounds like fiction, but I swear it's fact. And today's story, well, it really is a case of fact being far stranger than fiction. I'm your host, and today we're travelling to the remote goldfields of Western Australia in the 30s, where an author's creative process became entangled with a series of brutal murders. This is the story of novelist Arthur Upfield, his fictional detective Napoleon Bonaparte, and a man named Snowy Rolls, who allegedly turned Upfield's fictional perfect murder into a horrifying reality. Imagine sitting around a campfire in the vastness of the outback, discussing with fellow workers how to commit the perfect crime, as a thought experiment for a novel you're writing. Then imagine discovering that one of those listeners has taken your carefully crafted fictional murder method and used it to kill 3 men. This extraordinary case raises chilling questions about the relationship between imagination and action, between fiction and reality. It's a story of gold, greed, and the vast emptiness of the Australian outback, where men can vanish without a trace, where secrets can be buried in the endless red soil, and where a writer's words can have deadly consequences. By 1930, Arthur Upfield was a man at a crossroads. After spending nearly 20 years in the Australian outback working various jobs, he'd come to a realisation about his future. "I was getting nowhere," he would later write, "and my only talent was writing, through which I might reach a standard of life more fitting to the growing years and responsibilities." His current position as a boundary rider for the Western Australian government involved patrolling 163 miles of the rabbit-proof fence from Camel Station down to the town of Burracoppin. This immense barrier, one of the longest netted fences in the world, had been erected in the early 1900s to keep wild rabbits out of farmlands on the western side of Australia. Every month, Upfield, and plenty of men just like him, walked or rode along the length of the fence, clearing fallen trees, replacing rotten fence posts and repairing damage to the netting. It was demanding solitary work, but it provided Upfield with something invaluable, an intimate knowledge of the Australian landscape and its people, both European and Aboriginal. This deep understanding had already begun to inform his literary endeavours, with his first novel, The House of Cain, published in 1929. The book told the story of an innocent woman convicted of murder and sentenced to hang, who was rescued from jail by a gang of thieves and taken to a remote outback location, serving as a refuge for murderers. His literary breakthrough had come shortly after, with the publication of his second novel, The Barrackee Mystery, which introduced the character who would become his signature creation, Inspector Napoleon Bonaparte, a half-European, half-Aboriginal detective with an uncanny ability to read the subtle signs of the outback landscape. By the end of 1930, Upfield had completed a third novel and was already working on his fourth. This new work, which would eventually be titled The Sands of Windee, was to be another bony mystery, but with a challenging twist. The detective would need to establish that a murder had occurred without the presence of a body, determine the method, and ultimately identify the killer. It was an ambitious premise that would test both Boney's skills and Upfield's ingenuity as a writer. However, the concept had quickly run into a practical problem. Upfield couldn't devise a method for his fictional murderer to dispose of a body without leaving any trace. The solution needed to be accessible to an ordinary person in the outback, using only readily available tools and materials. Faced with this creative challenge, Upfield regularly shared his plot problem with the gathered men around the campfire. Night after night, as the flames danced against the star-filled outback sky, he would return to his literary dilemma, like a dog with a bone. How could his fictional murderer make a body disappear so completely that even the brilliant Detective Inspector Bonaparte would struggle to prove a crime had occurred? The men listened with varying degrees of interest as Upfield explored different possibilities. Some suggested dropping the victim down a mine shaft, others proposed weighted burial in a swamp. But each suggestion had flaws, evidence that could be discovered, remains that could be found. The perfect murder remained frustratingly elusive. Then, on one such night, came George Ritchie's response, delivered with an immediacy that should have been unsettling. When Upfield posed the problem one October evening in 1929, his friend Ritchie didn't hesitate, didn't pause to think. His answer came swift and detailed. Burn the body with firewood and animal carcasses. Sift the ashes meticulously for metal fragments, dispose of any jewellery or buckles down a well, grind the remaining bone fragments to powder and scatter the dust to the wind. The specificity was chilling. This wasn't the fumbling speculation of a man thinking aloud. It was the methodical recitation of someone who had clearly given the matter considerable thought. As one later analyst would observe, Ritchie spoke as though he'd been thinking about killing someone and getting rid of evidence for a while. In the flickering shadows beyond the fire's reach, John Thomas Smith, the man they knew as Snowy Rolls, listened intently to every word. While the other men might have dismissed Ritchie's response as macabre creativity, Rolls absorbed the details with a different kind of attention. His fair hair caught the occasional glint of firelight as he leaned forward, but his expression remained hidden in the darkness. Unknown to the others, Rolls carried secrets that made Ritchie's fictional method far more than academic interest. As an escaped convict living under a false identity, he understood better than most the value of making inconvenient people disappear. And as Ritchie continued to elaborate on his disposal technique, the precise burning times, the importance of thorough sifting, the need to pulverise every fragment of bone, Rolls filed away each detail with the careful attention of a man who might one day have cause to use them. As Upfield continued to work through this narrative challenge, life along the rabbit-proof fence maintained its usual rhythms. He would ride out each morning on patrol, his caravan pulled by camels rather than horses, carrying the tools of his trade. Wire cutters, hammers, fence posts, alongside his portable typewriter, the instrument of his growing second profession. The isolation of the job suited Upfield's contemplative nature. Hours spent in the company of only the fence, the vast West Australian landscape, and his own thoughts had honed his observational skills and provided the solitude needed for a writer to develop his craft. The boundary between his physical work, maintaining the fence, and his mental work, crafting narratives, often blurred, each informing and enriching the other. What Upfield could not have anticipated, though, was how this blurring of boundaries would soon extend beyond his own experience, how the theoretical problem of the perfect murder, discussed as a literary challenge around campfires, would leap from the realm of fiction into the harsh reality of the outback. The creative dilemma that occupied his thoughts would soon become a crucial element in a real-world mystery that would shock the region and ultimately change the course of his literary career in ways he could never have imagined. In December 1929, just months after those campfire discussions about the perfect murder, Snowy Rolls departed from Camel Station accompanied by two men, a station contractor named James Ryan and a newcomer to the area named George Lloyd. Their stated destination was Ryan Station, some distance away. Rolls cut a distinctive figure in the region with his shock of white blonde hair that had earned him his nickname. At 25, he worked as a stockman at Camel Station, the same outpost where Upfield was based during his fence riding duties. Those who knew him described him as capable and personable, though somewhat reserved, a quality not uncommon among men drawn to the isolation of outback work. But what few in the area knew was that Rolls carried a secret. His real name was John Thomas Smith, and he was an escaped convict who had fled from the Dalwallanu lockup in 1928, where he'd been held on burglary charges. In the fluid, transient society of the outback, where men often reinvented themselves and questions about one's past were considered impolite, Rolls had successfully established this new identity. Several days after Rolls departed with Ryan and Lloyd, George Ritchie, Upfield's friend who had suggested the perfect murder method, arrived at Camel Station with a curious story. Ritchie claimed that he had encountered a prospector named James Yates who reported seeing Rolls driving a car alone. According to Ritchie, Rolls had told Yates that Ryan and Lloyd were walking through the scrub looking for timber, though Yates himself hadn't seen them. On Christmas Eve 1929, Upfield encountered Rolls in the small town of Uunmi. During their conversation, Rolls explained that he was driving Ryan's truck because Ryan had decided to stay in Mount Magnet and had lent him the vehicle. Later, Rolls told another person that he had purchased Ryan's truck for 80 quid. The disappearance of Ryan and Lloyd initially raised few concerns. The region had a large transient population, and it was not unusual for men to appear and vanish without explanation as they followed work opportunities across the vast outback. But events several months later would cast these disappearances in a sinister new light. In May 1930, a New Zealander named Lewis Carron, who had been working at Widgie Station, quit his job and left in the company of Rolls. At Painesville, a mining town east of Mount Magnet, witnesses observed Rolls cashing Carron's paycheck. When Carron's friends sent a reply-paid telegram to Rolls at Uunmi inquiring about Carron's whereabouts, Rolls never responded. Unlike Ryan and Lloyd, whose disappearances had gone largely unremarked, Carron's absence quickly triggered concern. He had maintained regular correspondence with friends and family back home, making his sudden silence conspicuous. As police began investigating Carron's disappearance, they made a disturbing connection. Ryan and Lloyd had also vanished. And in all three cases, it was Rolls who was the last person known to have seen them alive. By this time, it was common knowledge throughout the Murchison region that Arthur Upfield was writing a novel about the perfect murder. The method he and Ritchie had discussed around campfires had become something of a local talking point. When police investigators learned of Upfield's novel and the campfire discussions about the perfect murder methods, they immediately recognised the potential significance. But their interest extended beyond simply connecting the fictional method to real crimes. They began investigating whether the author himself might have been involved. Arthur Upfield soon found himself in the uncomfortable position of being questioned by detectives. Had his discussions with Rolls been more extensive than he'd initially revealed? Was there any financial relationship between them? Could the struggling author have provided more than just theoretical advice? The investigation into Upfield was thorough, but ultimately brief. His cooperation with authorities, his documented presence elsewhere during the murders, and the testimony of multiple witnesses who had heard the campfire discussion all supported his innocence. Most importantly, he had no motive. He didn't know the victims, had no financial interest in their deaths, and had openly discussed the murder method with numerous people, hardly the behaviour of someone planning to use it for actual crimes. Nevertheless, when the case came to trial, the Crown prosecution would make a startling allegation. As Upfield would later write in his defence, "Although I did not provide Rolls with a motive, and in no way an accessory before or after the fact, the Crown alleged that I did provide him with a method of destroying the bodies of the victims." Acting on this information, they organised a search focused on areas associated with Rolls' movements. Near the 183-mile hut along the rabbit-proof fence, they discovered evidence of a large fire. Sifting through the ashes, they found remnants of a human body. Fragments of bones and pieces of skull later identified as belonging to Lewis Curran. Among these grim discoveries was a wedding ring that was positively linked to Curran through identification by both the jeweller in New Zealand who had made it and Curran's spouse. The evidence suggested that Rolls had indeed attempted to employ the perfect murder method described by Upfield and Ritchie, but had made a crucial error. He had failed to thoroughly sift through the ashes for metal objects and bone fragments. This oversight, this deviation from the literary method, had left behind the very evidence that now implicated him in Curran's death. Further investigation uncovered similar fire sites at Charlie Bore near Ryan's camp. From these ashes, investigators extracted the eyelets of boots and metal parts of an accordion similar to the one that Lloyd had owned. They also found fragments of bones, though these were so small that experts were unable to determine whether they belonged to humans or animals. The question arose, why would someone burn boots, clothing and an accordion unless they wished to destroy evidence of vital importance? These items would normally be discarded if broken or worn out, not meticulously destroyed by fire. The presence of multiple fire sites, each containing personal items that could be linked to the missing men, painted a disturbing picture of methodical elimination. Both the 183-mile hut and Charlie Bore were strategically advantageous locations for concealing such activities. These sites routinely saw the burning of kangaroo carcasses, resulting in substantial piles of ash and animal remains that could help camouflage human remains. However, the unusual presence of fragmented bones raised suspicions. When detectives moved to apprehend Rolls, they recognised him as the escaped convict John Thomas Smith. He was arrested and returned to prison to serve his original sentence for the burglary conviction. Later, he was charged with the murder of Lewis Curran based on the evidence recovered from the fire sites. The circumstantial evidence pointed strongly to a triple murder. Police believed that Rolls had disposed of Ryan and Lloyd's remains at Charlie Bore, being more careful in those earlier attempts than in Curran's case. However, despite their suspicions, the prosecution struggled to establish conclusive evidence connecting Rolls to the murders of Ryan and Lloyd. The charge brought against him was solely for Curran's death, where the physical evidence was the strongest. As the investigation unfolded and Rolls awaited trial, the horrifying reality became clear. The theoretical perfect murder method, developed as a creative challenge for a detective novel, had apparently been put into practice. Uppfield's literary problem had become a real-world tragedy, with his fictional scenario serving as the blueprint for actual killings that had claimed the lives of these three men. The Supreme Court in Perth stood as a monument to British colonial justice, all sandstone gravity and imposing columns designed to inspire both awe and submission. The case of the Crown versus John Thomas Smith, alias Snowy Rolls, had drawn unprecedented attention. Newspapers across Western Australia hailed it as the most sensational murder trial of the decade. The unusual connection between a novelist's creative process and actual murders had captivated not just local readers, but an international media. Inside the courtroom, Rolls maintained the same composure he had shown throughout the investigation. Even as the prosecution laid out their case, he remained outwardly unaffected, his striking white blonde hair making him instantly recognisable to anyone who had seen the newspaper illustrations. The prosecution's case rested primarily on physical evidence from one murder, that of Lewis Curran. While they suspected Rolls had killed all three men, The forensic evidence for Ryan and Lloyd's death was just not there. At the 183 Mile Hut fire site, they had found Karen's distinctive wedding ring with its unique 9-carat solder repairs. Human bone fragments and personal effects provided additional confirmation. For the other 2 alleged victims, however, evidence was circumstantial. At Charlie Bore, investigators found boot eyelets and accordion parts matching items owned by the missing men, along with bone fragments so small that forensic experts couldn't definitively determine whether they belonged to humans or animals. The limitations of 1930s forensic science meant that questions would remain forever unanswered. Most compelling was how the fire sites showed clear attempts to implement the perfect murder method discussed around that campfire. The prosecution described how Rolls had been present during those discussions and how he had tried to follow Ritchie's detailed instructions. The fatal flaw, the murderer's failure to dissolve the metal fragments in acid as specified, had provided the very evidence needed to build the case against him. Arthur Upfield took the witness stand as a prosecution witness, not as a defendant, though the distinction felt uncomfortably thin. With evident distress, he described a literary problem he had faced and the discussions that had taken place as he sought a solution. The boundary writer turned novelist had found himself in the unbearable position of having potentially enabled the very kind of crime his fictional detective was designed to solve. Yet even as Upfield testified, questions lingered about George Ritchie, the man who had so readily provided the murder method. Ritchie's suspiciously detailed knowledge and quick response to Upfield's plotting problem had never been thoroughly investigated. Had the method truly been improvised, or had it come from darker sources? Rolls's defence maintained his innocence throughout the trial. They questioned the identification of bone fragments, suggested alternative explanations for the burning of personal items, and attempted to cast doubt on the connections the prosecution had drawn between the disappearances of Ryan, Lloyd, and Karen. But despite the defence's efforts to cast doubt on the identification of bone fragments and suggest alternative explanations for the burning of personal items, the jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Roll made a statement that would haunt the case for decades. "I have been found guilty of a crime that has never been committed." Was this the final defiance of a guilty man, or the desperate truth-telling of someone wrongfully convicted? The statement raised disturbing questions that the court had no interest in exploring. If Rolls hadn't committed the murder, what explained the physical evidence? Had someone else killed the victims and left Rolls to take the blame? Or was he suggesting that the deaths weren't murders at all, perhaps accidents that had been covered up using the disposal method he'd heard around the campfire? The court, however, had reached its verdict. Rolls was sentenced to death and transferred to Fremantle Prison to await execution. On June 13th, 1932, he was hanged, maintaining his innocence right until the very end. The case's resolution, however, brought no peace to Arthur Upfield. The sensational media coverage, newspapers calling it Western Australia's crime of the century, had painted him as everything from an unwitting accomplice to a criminal mastermind. The fact that he'd been investigated by police, however briefly, and that the Crown had explicitly alleged he provided the murder method, created a cloud of suspicion that threatened to destroy his emerging literary career. In 1934, just 2 years after the trial, Upfield launched an aggressive media campaign to clear his name. He wrote detailed defences in the Melbourne Herald and Adelaide Advertiser, published a non-fiction book called The Murchison Murders, and gave numerous interviews protesting his innocence. This wasn't the behaviour of someone confident in his public exoneration. It was the desperate response of a man whose reputation and livelihood hung in the balance. "I am not a murderer," Upfield insisted in one newspaper interview. "I am a writer who discussed a fictional problem around a campfire. That someone took those words and used them for evil is not my responsibility. though I'll carry the burden of that knowledge for the rest of my life. Meanwhile, Arthur had completed his novel, The Sands of Windee, the story that had inadvertently become entwined with real-life tragedy. Set on a fictional cattle station called Windee, it featured the mysterious disappearance of a character named Luke Marks. Detective Inspector Bonaparte, through his exceptional observational skills and knowledge of the outback, would ultimately solve the crime by identifying the fatal flaw in the murder's otherwise perfect method. The novel was published in 1931, earning Upfield acclaim from both critics and fellow writers. The notoriety of its connection to the Rolls case undoubtedly contributed to its success, though Upfield himself struggled with the knowledge that his creative process had intersected with actual murders in such a disturbing way. The case became a defining moment in Australian criminal history, a bizarre instance where fiction preceded fact, where a writer's imagination unwittingly provided the template for a series of killings that might otherwise have remained perfect mysteries. For Upfield, it was a dark beginning of a successful literary career that would span more than 30 books and countless short stories, establishing him as one of Australia's most distinctive crime writers, even as he carried the burden of his unwitting connection to this real-world tragedy. Decades later, as historians began re-examining the Murchison murders with fresh eyes and access to previously sealed documents, a more disturbing picture emerged. The case that had captivated the world as a unique instance of fiction inspiring reality might have been something far more sinister, a cover-up for colonial violence that reached into the highest levels of Western Australia's establishment. In 2018, researcher Bill Casey uncovered evidence suggesting that the perfect murder method hadn't originated from George Ritchie's imagination at all, but from documented police atrocities against Aboriginal people. The 1927 Wood Royal Commission had investigated systematic killings in the East Kimberley, where police had been burning bodies to destroy evidence of their crimes. Dr. D.S. Mackenzie's testimony about scientific body disposal methods, including the precise 4.5-hour burning time needed to reduce a human body to ash, had been published in local newspapers, including the Geraldton Guardian. This revelation cast George Ritchie in an entirely different light. Rather than improvising a fictional solution around a campfire, he may have been describing real techniques used by colonial authorities to conceal their crimes against Indigenous Australians. His suspiciously detailed knowledge and immediate response to Upfield's query suddenly seemed less like creative inspiration and more like insider information. If this theory was correct, then the Murchison murders weren't just about greed or escaped convicts. They were connected to the broader pattern of violence that defined Australia's frontier. The same techniques used by police to destroy evidence of massacres had been adapted by a criminal to eliminate inconvenient witnesses to his false identity. But this interpretation raised even more troubling questions. Had Ritchie been involved in the original atrocities? Was his knowledge of body disposal methods more than theoretical? And perhaps most disturbingly, had the quick arrest and execution of Snowy Rolls been designed to prevent deeper investigation into connections between the murders and official violence? George Ritchie himself had never been thoroughly investigated. Unlike Upfield, who faced police questioning and public scrutiny, Ritchie remained in the shadows, the man who provided the method but escaped examination. Contemporary accounts described him as having a quick answer, as though he'd been thinking about killing someone and getting rid of evidence for a while. Yet no detective ever explored what that thinking might have involved or where such detailed knowledge might have originated. The speed of Rolls' trial and execution, less than 2 years from arrest to hanging, also seems suspicious in hindsight. For a case of such complexity and public interest, the legal proceedings had moved with unusual haste. Had authorities been eager to close the case before uncomfortable connections could be explored? Even Rolls' final statement, "I have been found guilty of a crime that has never been committed," took on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Perhaps he hadn't been protesting his complete innocence, but rather his status as a scapegoat for crimes that had reached far beyond 3 dead prospectors in the goldfields. These questions would never be definitively answered. By the time historians began asking them, all the key players were long dead, their secrets buried as thoroughly as the victims whose ashes had scattered across the West Australian desert. The perfect crime, it seemed, might not have been the disposal of 3 murder victims. It might have been the way an entire system of colonial violence was hidden behind the compelling story of a novelist's imagination turned deadly. Arthur Upfield himself took these doubts to his grave. In his later years, he occasionally expressed uncertainty about the case that had both launched and nearly destroyed his career. "I wonder, sometimes," he confided to a friend in the 1950s, "whether we ever really understood what happened out there. The truth might be darker than any fiction I could imagine." In the decades following the Rolls case and his execution, Arthur Upfield's career flourished, despite, or perhaps partly because of, the notoriety associated with his name. The character of Napoleon Boney Bonaparte captured readers' imaginations, appearing in 29 novels that took audiences on journeys across the diverse landscapes of Australia, from the arid deserts of the interior to the tropical north. Upfield had found his literary voice in Boney, a detective whose mixed heritage gave him unique insights into both European and Aboriginal worlds. The character's exceptional tracking skills derived from his Aboriginal upbringing, combined with his European education to create a detective who could read the subtle signs of the outback environment like no other fictional sleuth. In many ways, Boney embodied Upfield's own deep understanding of the Australian landscape gained through his years of solitary work along the rabbit-proof fence. The success of the Boney novels eventually allowed Upfield to leave behind the physical demands of boundary riding and other outback jobs, fulfilling his ambition to make a living through his writing. And yet, despite this success, the shadow of the Rolls case never fully receded. Journalists interviewing Upfield throughout his career inevitably raised the connection between the sands of Windee and the murders that had occurred in the Murchison. For Upfield, it remained a deeply uncomfortable association, a reminder that worlds conceived as fiction had somehow leaped into deadly reality, or perhaps had been rooted in deadly reality all along. For the families of Ryan, Lloyd and Karen, the legacy was more personal and painful. While Rolls was convicted of Karen's murder, the circumstantial evidence for the other deaths meant their families lived with ambiguous grief, believing their loved ones were dead, but without the closure of definitive resolution. The speed of Rolls' execution had foreclosed any possibility of extracting additional information about the other victims' fates. The communities of the Murchison region incorporated the story into local folklore. Though the version that survived often sanitised the colonial violence connections, the rabbit-proof fence, already a significant feature of the Western Australian landscape, gained an additional layer of mythology through its connection to the case. Travellers along the fence would sometimes detour to visit the sites associated with the murders, drawn by the macabre fascination that notorious crimes often inspire. The vast emptiness of the outback plays more than a backdrop role in this story. It's almost a character itself. A landscape so immense, so unforgiving, that it makes both perfect murders and perfect cover-ups seem possible. A place where bodies can burn to ash and scatter onto the wind, where evidence disappears into red soil, where uncomfortable connections between individual crimes and official violence can be buried as thoroughly as human remains. Thanks again for listening to Strewth. If this story of fiction, reality and the darker truths that connect them keep you enthralled, follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a rating, tell a friend, all that sort of stuff. Next week, we'll be exploring the mysterious Westall UFO incident of 1966, when hundreds of school children and teachers witnessed an unexplained flying object descend right next to their Melbourne school. An event that remains one of Australia's most compelling mass sightings. In fact, one of the world's most compelling UFO sighting. But until then, stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll catch you next time.